Imagine that you were raising your children in a world that had dragons and fairies in it. I mean, a world where they should expect to encounter at least one dragon and at least one fairy in their actual lives. So these things are not just present in the world, but prevalent enough that everyone has experience with them. They fundamentally shape the nature of the world. Do you think that an education that did not prepare the child for an encounter with a dragon or fairy would be a good education in that world? Of course not. Education has the job of creating individuals who are well disposed and equipped to deal with the things they will encounter in the world they actually live in, as well as any world to which they could conceivably come. Well, if the world we live in is a world of wonders, then it is incumbent upon the education of the child to prepare the child for wonder. This looks different at different times, but it also looks different for different children. In our particular time, when we are experiencing a deep and widespread loss of the recognition that the world is a wonderful place, the first step is to equip children to engage the world as a place of wonder. Therefore, the first task of education in these late times is a task of re-enchantment. Well, how does classical education go about doing this? I will say up front that I think classical education is particularly well suited and situated to the task of reawakening the soul to the reality that the world is a wonder place. Consider the major educational alternative, progressive or modern education, whose great leading light is John Dewey. Dewey says this: I believe that the only true education comes through the stimulation of the child's powers by the demands of the social situations in which he finds himself. Through these demands, he is stimulated to act as a member of a unity, to emerge from his original narrowness of action and feeling, and to conceive of himself from the standpoint of the welfare of the group to which he belongs. The goal of education, Dewey says, is to create individuals who see the world more broadly than their own particular viewpoint. Specifically, he wants them to think of themselves in relation to their society and the goods of that society. And that's not so bad. But what's missing is any reference to what type of person this young individual is being made into from a moral standpoint. One can be a good citizen of a democracy and a monster, because no form of governance either promotes or requires any particular moral capacity. One could be a rampant reductionist, a deep pessimist, and an unrepentant hedonist, and yet still be a good product of this educational model. Classical education, by contrast, is looking not to make good members of our society, but good human beings. Now, what it takes to be a good human being is something that must be delivered from outside the bounds of classical education. And so if one thinks that what makes a good human being is reductionist, pessimistic hedonism, then classical education can help you get there. However, because classical education is also historically grounded in the actual practice of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the Christian Middle Ages, while it is not the role of classical education as such to determine what is a good human, it nevertheless presupposes certain truths about the human. Specifically, it presupposes that the human being is not the pinnacle of all existence, but exists in a layered hierarchy with greater realities above it. The human being is not the source of its own existence, and it lies open to and vulnerable to transcendent realities. In the three cultural situations I mentioned above, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Christian Middle Ages, this is understood explicitly in a religious and theistic sense. The human being is a human under God or the gods, and therefore good human action must have reference to the divine dimension. Remember that God is a God of wonders. God creates wonder because God desires wonder, and God desires wonder because God is himself the first wonder and the fountain of wonder. Therefore, the world in which students live is a world of wonder because it is the type of world that God desired, and because it is a world whose intention is to lead us back to the God of wonders. The wonderful character of creation is the way in which all things declare the glory of God, which they do simply by existing, and by existing as the types of things they are. For the existence of anything that is not capable of grounding its own existence, that is, anything but God, preaches the existence of something else that is able to ground both its own existence and the existence of other things. And in this way, the existence of anything created preaches the existence of a creator. And the particularities of each thing witness to an intentionality that even atheists have a hard time letting go of. It is why when they speak of processes like natural selection, it sounds very much as if natural selection is selecting things. That is to say, making choices in accordance with desires. Even more than this, the beauty of each thing, which is that which we wonder at when we recognize it truly, is a particular way of imaging God and reminding us of God. That before which we stand mute in awe whenever we see that anything is wonderful is the Christ-likeness that belongs to it by being this thing that God created it to be. Trees represent the divine nature in an arboreal fashion, dogs in a canine fashion, cats in a feline fashion, cows in a bovine fashion. God is not a tree or a dog or a cat or a cow, nor are any of these things like enough to God to have been declared the image of God in Genesis. Nevertheless, they each preach something true, real, and important about the divine essence that none of the others preach. Well, if all of that is true, then the proper way to orient students to the world is to train them to recognize the wonder that inheres in the world by virtue of its existing, and existing in just this way, and also to train them in the ability to follow the intimations of glory that each creature is back to the Lord of glory who made it for specifically this purpose of declaring his glory. Right, so how does classical education do this? It does so in multiple ways. First, it brings the student into conversation with the great minds of the past who have recognized these things and thought meaningfully and written beautifully about them. By doing so, by bringing the student back to primary sources, it gives these great thinkers to the student as companions on their journey of discovering the wonder of this world. For we never read in isolation. We're always reading with someone, whether we realize it or not. The very fact of reading in some language guarantees this, because we are not the author of our mother language. But beyond this, we are also reading with others of our time and culture, with our families and friends, with the musical and cinematic artists to whom we've given our heart for shaping, confusing their physical beauty or their talent for depth of wisdom, and so on. You cannot read alone. Therefore, you must give thought to who you want to be reading with. Classical education aims to ensure that our children, whoever else they may be reading with, are also reading with some of the best thinkers we know. But interestingly, we don't only expose the students to people we would like them to be reading along with. There are some of what the Middle Ages would call negative exemplars on our reading lists. For example, I doubt very much that your school administrators and teachers would want your students to be reading the world along with Nietzsche. Nevertheless, I wouldn't be surprised, and in fact expect, to find him on the syllabus, or at least on the broader list of works that are worth the students' attention at some developmentally appropriate point. This is because it is not only by providing good companions for the journey of interpreting the world that classical education progresses. It also aims to train your child to discern well. Consider one of my favorite lines from Macbeth. Angels are bright still, though the brightest fell. Though all things foul would wear the brows of grace, yet grace must still look so. These lines argue that even though demons disguise themselves as angels, angels don't change their appearance. But if that is so, then it becomes an important question to know, how do you tell an angel apart from a seeming angel? This is the work of discernment, which separates the true not only from the false, but also from the pretending to be true. Discernment requires knowledge, wisdom, experience, and attention. It must be trained, and it is trained not only by looking at the true, but also by looking at the false. Critical thinking is not a goal in itself, it is a tool meant to make true discernment possible. Therefore, educating for critical thinking, apart from the question of the discernment of the true, the good, and the beautiful, from the false, the evil, and the ugly, provides students with a dangerous weapon and no instruction on how to use it. Classical education also believes that students will be best prepared to do work similar to the work done by the great minds of the past if they spend time imitating the great minds of the past. We cannot always be sure that we have identified the salient aspects of the training of a mind like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. Imitating their manner of proceeding, even as nothing more than an academic exercise, may in fact deliver to the student an important aspect of their thinking that we have not yet correctly identified in our analysis. Imitation is a way of bestowing attention upon a thing, and it leads the student quickly to sympathy. That is to say, the understanding of the motive, reasons, and forces behind a thing. This sympathy is an essential and indispensable part of understanding. To put it another way, understanding is an act of sympathy. Furthermore, classical education aims to grow the student's imagination. It is a simple yet unbreakable law of thinking that no one ever considers something that has never occurred to him or her. Go ahead, give it a try. Think about something that it does not occur to you to think about. Got it? Okay, now if you've got something in mind, that's wrong, because that thing has occurred to you. You need something that has never occurred to you, and that does not occur to you now. But then how are you meant to think about it if it in no way exists in your mind or awareness? Many of the struggles and toils of very many human persons remain in force in that person's life, or even increase their hold over that person, because that person lacks the imagination to see a way out. It is true that once we have seen a way out, we may not have the fortitude to take it. And yet there can be no question of taking it if we have not even seen it. For this reason, it is of utmost importance to train the student's ability to imagine. Imagination is the number one thing students need in order to have maximal access to good options in their lives. It is also what they need to solve problems in society, or in the church, or in their families, or in their friendships. When Francis of Assisi began his life of radical obedience and devotion to Lady Poverty, it was something that no one had conceived in just that way before. Now, over 1.2 million humans around the world follow the Franciscan way of life. Imagination is trained by exposure to ideas, cultures, and situations different from those the students encounter in their everyday lives. It is also trained by stories of all sorts. Stories of the lives and deaths of saints. Stories of the great men and women of history who have reshaped the face of the world by their deeds and writings and discoveries. Stories of what God has done for his people through the ages. Stories of mythological beings and creatures and demigods whose action exceeds the scope of what is possible for mere natural humans. Stories of other worlds that have never existed except in the minds of their creator and in the mind of the creator God, but that nevertheless show to us true aspects of the world in which we live. Stories of what could be. The imagination is also trained by promises. The dreams and visions of poets, statesmen, visionaries, and above all the promises of the Lord delivered in Scripture, which give us access to a world we would never dare to hope for ourselves, but for which we are in fact historically destined by the will of the Almighty God. A mind trained on such stories and promises will not easily be conquered by the fact that something seems impossible. It will know how to press beneath the surface of seeming and interrogate the underlying conditions to determine if that which at first appears impossible is in fact only difficultly possible.